Happy Saturday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. I'm currently on location. I'm at a hotel in Beijing. I'm here for the next few days to talk to contacts about this week's two sessions. My apologies for the informal hotel surroundings here. I hope it is not too distracting. With that said, we have a lot to discuss, so let's jump in. And first up, in a landmark ruling on yesterday, a federal judge in the US state of Missouri found that the Chinese government is responsible for covering up the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic and hoarding critical protective equipment. The judgment, totaling over $24 billion, was hailed by Missouri officials who vowed to enforce it by seizing Chinese-owned assets. The lawsuit, initially filed in April of 2020 by the Missouri Attorney General's office, accused China of withholding critical information about the virus while restricting global access to personal protective equipment, PPE. The case was met with silence from Beijing, which did not respond in court, and officials from the Chinese embassy in Washington have so far declined to comment as of late Friday evening US time. In the ruling, the judge of the US District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri condemned China's actions, stating, quote, "China was misleading the world about the dangers and scope of the COVID-19 pandemic," end quote, and had, quote, "engaged in monopolistic actions to hoard PPE." End quote. He concluded that these actions significantly impaired the early US response to the pandemic and exacerbated the shortage of medical supplies. The judge held multiple Chinese entities accountable, including the government, the ruling Communist Party, local Chinese governments, a health agency, and a laboratory within the country. The judge initially dismissed the case, but after an appeal court reinstated it, he proceeded with a bench trial in January. China did not send legal representation to defend against the claims. Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey, a Republican, applauded the decision, saying, quote, "China refused to show up to court, but that doesn't mean that they get away with causing untold suffering and economic devastation. We intend to collect every penny by seizing Chinese-owned assets, including Missouri farmland." End quote. The ruling revives scrutiny over China's handling of the pandemic's early days. In 2020, shortly after Missouri filed the lawsuit, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Gang Shuang dismissed the claims as, quote, "very absurd," end quote, and lacking any, quote, "factual and legal basis," end quote. However, the judge found Missouri's legal team successfully demonstrated that China was aware of human-to-human transmissions well before it publicly acknowledged the risk. Additionally, the ruling pointed to China's efforts to nationalize American factories in China to produce protective equipment, limiting global supply and inflating prices. Former Missouri Attorney General and current U.S. Senator Eric Schmidt, who initiated the lawsuit, celebrated the ruling, stating on social media, quote, "When I was AG in Missouri, I sued China for unleashing COVID on the world. Missouri can now seize assets," end quote. The ruling marks a significant legal and diplomatic flashpoint, though questions remain about how Missouri will enforce such a massive judgment against a foreign government. Legal experts anticipate that any attempt to seize Chinese assets will be met with international resistance and legal challenges. Nevertheless, Missouri officials remain, quote, "steadfast," end quote, in their, quote, "commitment to holding China accountable," end quote. Next up, we move to the Chinese economy. China's exports surged to a record level in the first 2 months of the year as businesses rushed to ship goods before higher US tariffs took effect. According to data from the General Administration of Customs, which, unlike other official data, is quite reliable as it can be compared with other customs officials from other countries with which they trade, published yesterday, exports rose 2.3% year-on-year to $540 billion, while imports dropped an incredible 8.4%. This resulted in a trade surplus of $170.5 billion. Economists had expected a stronger export performance, however, with the US-based Bloomberg forecasting a 5.9% rise and UK-based Reuters estimating 5%. The reality suggests that escalating trade tensions with the US are beginning to weigh on China's export growth. The latest figures reflect a slowdown from December's 10.7% increase, underscoring the challenges ahead for the world's second-largest economy. Bloomberg economist Eric Zhu expressed in a note yesterday, quote, "China's weaker-than-expected exports in the first 2 months of 2025 are a bad sign. The impacts of the US tariff hike in February and softening external demand appeared to have outweighed front-loading by US importers that were expected to buoy shipments, at least temporarily. The sharp and surprise drop in imports shows the economy is weak. End quote. The US imposed a 10% tariff on nearly all Chinese imports on February the 4th, and raised the levy to 20% earlier this week. While only 15% of China's direct exports go to the United States, many Chinese goods reach American markets through third-party countries like Vietnam and Mexico. The growing tariff war threatens a crucial pillar of China's economy, arguably its only healthy pillar based on the last few years of growth data, with exports accounting for nearly a third of its economic growth last year. Imports, meanwhile, like we said, fell sharply, signaling weak domestic demand. This decline could put further pressure on China's economy, despite Premier Li Qiang's recent announcement this week at the two sessions of a 5% GDP growth target for 2025. No doubt the government will reach this target, but if exports, the only bright spot in the economic data, are not what brings them to this point, then, as we've explained before, it will be unhealthy, debt-driven, unsustainable growth from local governments and local government-controlled entities like SOEs that will get them there. This will result in surging debt. The government has also increased fiscal spending in an effort to counterbalance trade-related slowdowns. We discussed this a few days ago. On the face of it, the export growth and large surplus looks like a good thing. Some commentators caution that the devil is very much in the details. Peking University professor of finance, Michael Pettis, for example, observed on the numbers today, quote, "Given what looked like decent consumption numbers in January, I was hoping that this would be partially reflected in China's trade data. But the trade numbers for the first 2 months of 2025 were awful," end quote. Adding, quote, "China's exports were up a lower than expected 2.3% in US dollar terms and 3.4% in RMB terms in January and February. These 2 months are always combined, but were a still staggering 450 billion. Compared to nominal GDP growth of 4%, exports are lagging the economy. But imports were the real problem. They were down 8.4% in US dollar terms and down 7.3% in RMB terms. This indicates that the revenues generated from exports are not being sufficiently recycled into wages and consequently into consumption. Add the two together, and the trade surplus for the first 2 months of the year was a whopping 171 billion US dollars. We don't want to read too much into 2 months' data, but so far the year hasn't started out terribly well," end quote. And Brad Setster, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, similarly observed today, quote, "The relentless upward march in China's trade surplus continued in January and February. The surplus, on a trailing 12-month basis, is clearly well over $1 trillion in the well-measured customs data. The rise in China's surplus seems real, and not primarily a function of tariff front-loading, and ongoing weakness in imports is concerning and suggests, to me at least, that internal demand remains very weak," end quote. That is today's episode of China Update. If you got some value, don't forget to hit the like button. If you'd like to continue to be on top of up-to-date analysis on China, maybe consider subscribing. Thank you everybody for watching. Again, please forgive the informality of this hotel room for filming. Have a good weekend, have a restful weekend, and I will see you all for a new week of updates on Monday.